So this is the third one about In Search of the Miraculous. To what extent can magic make impossible things happen? Now, as I warned at the introduction, if you're looking for sensational tales of extraordinary events, I can't provide them because this is not actually one of my key interests. I'm treating this topic with respect rather than wild enthusiasm, and I'll explain why. So, to start at the beginning with a simple thing, you know, Ramsey Jukes, have you ever seen a ghost? And the answer is yes, I have. One or two, I mean, the trouble is I don't really remember because they weren't very important, but there was one in particular that was significant, and I'll explain that experience. It was when I was at Cambridge, my second year, and as a scholar in Emmanuel College, I was given really lovely old rooms. Don't know when they dated back to, but you know, on a courtyard looking down onto a herb garden. And a few days into the beginning of term, I think it was, I was asleep and I woke up in the half-light with a sense of sort of dread, you know, prickling, typical sort of ghost story stuff. And I opened my eyes, I was lying on my back, and there was this ghost. Let me just demonstrate. It was a man leaning over the bed holding a dagger and snarling with rage. Now, how do I react to that? I could have done several things. I could have reached for the light switch, I could have screamed, I could have buried my head under the pillow. Several things. But what I did was stay dead still and stare at it. And it was definitely there, it's clearly there, and as I stared, it melted into the light and shade of a curtain at the end of my bed, a patterned curtain. So there was the offering of an explanation. My eyes had seen this patterned curtain, and my brain had superimposed an image of this snarling face based on the pattern. Just as, you know, the Rorschach test or whatever it is, where you're given this ink blot and you look at it and then you can see there's a girl reading a book. The shape is perfect. Well, what did I then do? I just kept on staring. I didn't move my eyes, I didn't move my head. You see, what interested me was, okay, I accepted this was like the Rorschach test. I'd seen a ghost when actually it was just swirly patterns on a curtain and the folds of a curtain. Because with the Rorschach test, you can look at that picture of the girl reading the book, and then you can see it as an ink blot, and then you can bring back the girl reading the book, and then you can see the ink blot. You can move between the two. So, if my brain had managed to form out of this pattern, but I was still staring at, the image of the snarling face holding the dagger, it would be able to do it again. But it couldn't. I stared and I could not see that image again. My brain wasn't able to recreate it. And yet, the explanation was, is that what it had done? Now, see, this really interested me because it was a one-way process. What had happened was that either you could say my brain had been fooled and seen this pattern, in which case why could it not see it again? But what I suggested was that my brain had normalized my experience. I'd seen something very alarming and my brain had made it safe by making it appear to be the patterns on the curtain. Now that might not seem a very impressive example, except that some years later, you know, Carlos Castaneda's book, his first book came out, and he described how Don Juan took him into the desert at the witching hour of twilight, and as he walked into the desert, he saw this monster, terrifying creature crouching there. And like me, instead of screaming and run away, he kept staring at it and he walked towards it. And then it resolved into something like a tree stump, something like that. You know. And as a rationalist, he was proud, you know. He hadn't gone balmy or been superstitious or ran away like an idiot. Instead, he kept his cool, and now he saw the truth. But Don Juan didn't say, "Well done, you weren't fooled." What Don Juan said is, "You lost the magic. There was magic there, and you banished it." Between the two of them, they were coming to a similar conclusion as I had. That the brain can normalize weird experiences. You see, when I was at school, I can't remember if I probably said this in an earlier interview, one of the things that puzzled me was, they say, all these wonderful books on magic. You know, if magic doesn't exist, why are all these books about it, so much written about it? And the answer I tended to be given was, well, you know, if you're brought up in a society where everyone believes in this nonsense, you know, they think there are fairies and things like that, then you're sort of brainwashed. You know, you will see fairies because you expect to see fairies, you see. And my response, and I was already beginning to think with the symmetry of a mathematician, I think, because I said, well, in that case, in our society where we're taught that there is no magic, these things don't exist, if magic actually happened, we wouldn't see it, would we? For the same reason. You know, it's just a question of symmetry for me. And so in a sense, this is what I was witnessing. Now, say not a very exciting example, but I refer back to what I said in the last video about that extreme rationalist in the 1950s after the war who could not even believe in hypnotism. And it was only when the person gave a post-hypnotic suggestion that half of the people were going to vanish, you know, I mean, in other words, 50% of each person was going to vanish, that he had such a shock that the guy had a sort of, you know, a breakdown and had to be reprogrammed out of it. You see, his mind was defending himself. He was actually being shown miracles, you know, snap my fingers, everyone vanishes, snap my fingers, they come back. But he was not seeing that. His mind was superimposing a normal explanation. You know, oh, they must have gone out, you know, oh, they've come back, even though they were all cripples in bed. Now, of course, my generation, we weren't so resistant, but I had one experience in particular of someone witnessing a miracle and not witnessing a miracle. And that was that same hypnotist, the medical hypnotist. He did a few of the usual things on stage, you know, this bit of chalk, hold it, it's getting hotter and hotter, ouch, you know, and the person would let go, things like that. And one person was a good subject. And so he gave the post-hypnotic suggestion that at, I think it was a particular time than after so many minutes, but I think it was sort of like at 25 past, you will come and pick up this piece of chalk and you will scribble on the blackboard and put it back. And sure enough, you know, the guy went back to his seat and the man got on with his lecture and he was in the mid-flow when this guy just, the audience just stood up, walked down to the front, picked up the piece of chalk and scribbled on the blackboard, put it back and then walked back and sat in his seat. Now, the hypnotist said, "Excuse me, why did you do that?" And the person said, "Oh, you know, I'd seen you giving post-hypnotic suggestions, suggestions about the chalk, you know, getting hot and things like that. And I just wondered whether you might have given me a post-hypnotic suggestion. So I thought I would just go down and check that the chalk was normal." A perfectly rational explanation, no magic, except, you see, for me and for a lot of people, it was magic because in a formal Cambridge lecture hall with a distinguished visiting speaker giving a lecture, you do not stand up in the middle, walk down without saying anything, pick up a piece of chalk and scribble on the board and go back. And this guy wasn't a sort of an extrovert or someone trying to make a great statement. He was just a sort of average shy guy, and he did that. That is not a physics-defying miracle, but it is something magical. And the person did it, and yet he had this rational explanation. Oh, I just wanted to check the chalk, So there was a miracle as far as I'm concerned, and the guy didn't see it. Again, he had normalized the situation by putting in a rational explanation. Now, so it looks as though the secret of, if magic is going to defy physics, we have to stop our brains from normalizing it. In other words, we have to allow the magic to happen. Now, I think there are actually very good reasons why this is not easy to do. I gave the example of the extreme rationalist who, practically had a nervous breakdown when he had to face a real miracle. But more generally, I gave the example, I wrote it up in Blast Your Way to Megabucks. It was one of the essays there, I think. I was working at a small town just off the M4 motorway in Britain. And one day, as I walked across the street, a car came down slowly because it was coming into this little town, and it suddenly swerved up onto the curb with a screech, and the man got out and we looked, and the front left wheel had just turned at right angles. I think it was a broken kingpin, meant that there was nothing holding it, and it had just gone at right angles, and the car just stood up onto the side. The man was in quite a state of shock because he'd just been coming down the motorway at 70 miles an hour. If that had happened, then him and his family in the car would have been killed, almost certainly. So it was a real sort of, my God, I got away with that sort of thing. Now you see, that was around the time of Uri Geller and this thing about bending forks, bending metal by the power of one's mind. Now, a lot of people seeing that wanted to be able to do it. They wanted the power to be able to look at a fork and it bends in front of your very eyes. They really wanted that. They were trying very, very, very hard. And some people apparently managed to do it. I didn't myself. Now, you see, imagine you did have that power. What would it take? It would probably take a very special, intense, focused concentration on the piece of metal in question. Now, you see, having seen that, what could happen to a kingpin, if I had that ability and I was going along the motorway at 70 miles an hour, could I stop myself from thinking, I hope the kingpin's okay? No, I mustn't concentrate on the kingpin. Yes, but what if, the kingpin, and the kingpin goes. You see, we depend so much on metal, and it's not bending and breaking in our everyday lives. Now, you go up in a lift, what if you start worrying about the thing holding the cable, holding on, things like that? If you're on an aeroplane, it only takes one tiny bit of metal to go wrong inside that fan jet, and that there is very, very good reasons why metal should not bend when we concentrate on it. It is a preservation thing. And I think in this article I ended up by saying, why is there so little magic in the world today? It's because we're all such good magicians. We are holding the world safe. We've made a safe world to live in. That's perhaps an extreme speculation, but the point is that I think the first step is, it isn't, can I make magic happen? Can I defy the laws of physics by concentrating and calling out a spell in Latin or whatever? Its first question is, can I allow magic into my life? And that is a real challenge. You really have to think very carefully about that. as to what the implications would be, and whether your mind would allow that to, your brain would allow that to happen. So that is my view on this. Now, let me think, was there something that followed from that? I'll move on. So, if I look at the next question after, have you ever seen a ghost? Was probably, tell me more about when you did the Abramelin operation. What were the weird things that happened then? Now, to me, the most magical thing that happened is one that certainly wouldn't astonish the physicists or anything like that. It was magical because of its significance to me. Now, I can't remember exactly the words in the books, talked about many years ago, but it says that when you start this operation, just a short few days or a few weeks into the operation, you will be visited by a tall, princely person who will try to lure you away from the operation. Now, I didn't know any tall, princely people, and so I didn't think much about that. But a couple of weeks in, I had the job opportunity of a lifetime presented to me. Now, you see, this was a time in my life when I was really at a low point. I was in a dead-end job, and I left it to go on the dole so I could do this operation. I really felt I'd blown my career, and there was nothing better to do than to do this thing. And then I had the offer of being flown out to Switzerland, where a very rich avant-garde artist was planning to build a garden of the gods, a huge, expensive project, and would I be flown out there to be an advisor on this? I mean, it would have changed my life. And the person who made this offer wasn't a prince, but he was young and tall, and he was a peer of the realm, a titled lord. And oh God, if I wasn't doing this operation, I would have jumped at that. It would have been life-changing. But I'd written my vow, and I had to get ahead with it. So that was a hugely dramatic thing for me. Very, very magical. But of course, you could just say it was a coincidence. There's nothing sort of physics-defying about that. But for me, that was probably one of the most intense indirect things that happened to me. I should say that when I first started, I was alone in the house. I was doing it in a suburban setting, and I had a very big garden of a shrubbery, and I built my oratory in that shrubbery. Now, as a country person, I would have chosen, if I'd had the ability, I wanted to go into deep country, to be completely on my own to do this. But in England, that isn't so easy. A 30-year-old man turns up on his own in a tiny cottage and sticks to himself. Very soon, kindly old ladies will be ringing round pies and sort of asking if I was okay and whether I was happy, and so on and so forth. You just draw attention to yourself in most country situations. We do something like that. And I realised, actually, although it wasn't my first choice, that to do it in the same semi-suburban, on the edge of a village green in a little village with other houses nearby, was actually the most obscure way I could do it, without causing much attention, and that's what I did. Now, among the sort of other sort of things that had significance for me, but were not that extraordinary, it says at one point that towards the end, I think it is, that you ask some question or something, and the answer will appear overnight on the silver lamen, and it says it'll appear like sort of almost like perspiration. Now, I did ask the question, and the next morning there was like mist on the Lamin. There was a picture which provided an answer, which actually fitted in with the I Ching reading I just had, so doubly significant. And so, I got the answer I wanted in that, and it was rather mysterious how it happened, just like they said. But the thing was, it could have been explained in terms of, in the damp British climate, there it was folded up in a cloth, and the cloth could have sort of left an imprint on it, I wasn't interested in that explanation, so it didn't wow me, I just thought, well, that's it, because the important thing was the message I got. Now, the only thing I can think of which would really sort of, get the psycho researchers excited was that right towards the end, a neighbour we had tall trees behind at the bottom of the garden, and beyond it was a housing estate. And the direct neighbour behind those trees said to me one morning, "What were you doing last night with that tree?" There was one tree standing alone very close to the oratory, and he said it was shaking and everything, and there was no wind. All the other trees were still, and this tree was shaking. I said I wasn't doing it. He said it was as though there was a big animal, sort of bull or something, bashing at it. And I said that's weird, because you see that if it was a cow that had got into the garden, it would have had to go all the way through my garden without making any marks. It couldn't have come from his side, because, say, his was his house and the suburban garden and things like that. It was completely cut off from the outside without crossing either things. And so, it was something which was an impossible physical occurrence. But I didn't know anything about it. Now, you see, if I was one of these sort of psycho research, I must prove that magic is real type people, I would have, I looked at the tree and I couldn't see any marks on it or anything. I would have inspected it very carefully, to make sure perhaps someone had put a rope around it or something. I would have looked at the soil around the roots to see if it had been shaken up, things like that. A lot of tests I could have done. I wasn't interested in that. I wasn't spending 6 months fasting, meditating, and all this dedication in order to make trees move around. I was doing it in order to have knowledge and conversation with my holy guardian angel. This was just a sideshow as far as I'm concerned. I just made a note of it in my diary, and that was that. Again, this thing of, for magic is what is really significant. And I suppose if their magical vow was to try to sort of show that physics was not real or something, then that would have been very significant, but it certainly wasn't significant for me. And this is reflected in a lot of the magical writing, like books on yoga, hatha yoga. They describe powers, this can give the power of levitation and so on and so forth. But they always say, but don't be distracted by those. The real thing is whatever, And Crowley, in his very austere, 8 lectures on yoga, I think it's there, he says, if you find extraordinary phenomena and things like that, make a note of them in your diary, but don't be distracted by them. That's not what it's all about. It's about clearing the mind, and so on. The only other thing, this is something I'd forgotten to say, was that I was doing it in this sort of suburban setting, in a house that I shared with a college friend, but at Easter, when you start the operation, he was away. And having written my vow, the atmosphere was absolutely electric, really sort of hair standing on end feeling. There was such a feeling of sort of power and presence in the thing, it was really quite scary. But when he came back, it had the effect of normalizing. Even though we were leading our separate lives in this house, just having, a familiar friend there meant a lot of that atmosphere went down. And I think if I had been in the deep country on my own completely, if that had been possible, it would have I would have stayed in that state of tension. So that really is, that really explains my attitude towards these things. I agree it's sort of interesting, as whether really impossible things can happen, but it isn't really what I'm doing magic for. And as an example of that, the person giving me this amazing job offer, that was hugely significant in my life and really made me think about what I was doing. And so that to me was a very powerful piece of magic, whereas a tree shaking in extraordinary circumstances was a sort of sideshow. And so I think I would sum this up by saying that it just really, the challenge is not whether with the force of will you can make scientifically impossible things happen. It's first think very carefully whether you would allow impossible things to happen, to what extent you would allow these impossible things to happen. Amazing coincidences are one thing, as long as they can be dismissed by other people as coincidences. And I think again in one of my articles I wrote this up in this way. I said, you take a taxi ride and you arrive late at your destination, reach your pocket and you've got no money. You think, oh my God, how would I have come on this journey without any money? And you pray to God, or you do a quick sigil or something, save me from this situation or give me money. And then you reach down and you realise there's a little row of pound coins on the seat beside you. Whew, enough to cover the fare. Saved. Your magic has worked. Now, do you then think, how could those coins have appeared just like that? Oh, they must have fallen out of my pocket, because surely I wouldn't have started the journey with no money on me. Oh yes, they're probably in my pocket and just fell out, and then I discovered them. In other words, do you go ahead with the normalizing process, or do you actually allow something miraculous has happened? And so I referred to that again, I think, in the last video, that the role of the conjurer, one of the roles is to be someone who in our ordinary world actually allows magic to happen for us. Thanks, that's it.